Hi, this is History with Andrew Allen, and today is episode 5 of the Cathar Crusade, the end of Simon de Montfort. Before I forget, I include the names of the people I talk about and my sources in the description. As I explained last episode, years of brutal warfare and harsh sieges had given Simon de Montfort control of almost all of the Languedoc region, aside from the city of Toulouse. Naturally, the burning of hundreds of Cathars and the slaughter of thousands of people, as well as the eviction of many noble families from their ancestral lands, had produced numerous enemies. But they mostly confined themselves to raids on supply convoys and isolated castles. However, Montfort had repeatedly provoked King Pedro of Aragon by waging war on his vassals, and a fed-up Pedro finally resolved to evict the troublesome northerner. Using the threat of Montfort as an excuse, Pedro persuaded all of the lords of the south to swear fealty to him. Since his brother Sancho was Count of Provence, the combination of Aragon, Toulouse, and Provence threatened to make a new power that could rival France. All Pedro had to do was defeat Montfort. Dismissing Count Raymond's advice to adopt a defensive strategy, Pedro rashly faced Montfort in battle at Muret on September 12, 1213. Although outnumbered, the disciplined crusaders smashed through the coalition cavalry, killing Pedro, which caused a rout. Instead of being driven out of the territory, Montfort had won a decisive victory, but he encountered the same problem as before. Just when he needed an army to garrison the castles that had either surrendered or were abandoned, much of his army disintegrated as men completed the 40 days service required to earn indulgences for their sins so they could return home and rack up more sins. However, the victory did elevate his social standing, and he was able to negotiate a marriage between his son Amaury and Beatrice, the niece of the Duke of Burgundy. Montfort was likely concerned about an intervention by King John, who arrived in nearby Aquitaine with a large army, while his allies Otto, Holy Roman Emperor, and the Counts of Boulogne, Brabant, and Flanders invaded France. However, the campaign did not go as planned. First, John was forced to retreat by Prince Louis, and then his allies were crushed at the massive battle at Bouvines on July 27, 1214, leaving King Philip of France the dominant power in Western Europe. While Innocent had no desire to accept the Cathar heresy, he was concerned that Montfort was exceeding the objectives of the crusade and becoming a distraction from the other crusades. So he replaced Papal Legate Amaury with Pietro of Benevento. An Italian, it was expected that he would follow the wishes of the Pope, which were clear. Pedro's 6-year-old heir James was to be released, and the Counts of Toulouse, Foix, and Comminges were to be allowed to reject heresy and rejoin the church. James had been entrusted to Montfort 3 years earlier as part of a plan to arrange peace with the Crusaders through a marriage between James and Montfort's daughter. James was handed back to the Lords of Aragon, but an overall peace would prove harder to achieve. It is worth observing that there would probably never be peace while Montfort lived. He loved war. He was good at it, and he profited from it. The Papal Legate convened a council at Narbonne in April 1214 that reconciled the southern lords with the church, so he presumed that he had faithfully executed the will of the Pope, thus ending the crusade. The Papal Crusade may have concluded after 5 years of bloodshed, but Montfort himself was not finished. Instead, he was determined to preserve his hard-won empire. Fortunately for him, a number of clerics wanted to continue the crusade and continued preaching. Montfort's rapid conquest of many small castles had produced swarms of refugee minor nobles with their large extended families of co-owners of fiefs, dependents, and courtiers that roamed the countryside. Called the Fedis, they were weakened but not broken. The Fedis had a victory in February 1214 when Count Raymond's estranged brother Baldwin was captured and executed for treason because he had joined the Crusaders. Baldwin had been raised in Paris after their parents' marriage was annulled in 1165, so he did not actually know his brother when he returned to Toulouse in 1194 following the death of their father. Actually, the Count of Foix and his son carried out the hanging, which suggests that the Count of Foix, a hard, merciless man who frequently mistreated his prisoners, was the driving force among the southern lords, not Count Raymond of Toulouse, an easygoing, tolerant man. When the Council of Southern Bishops met in Montpellier in January 1215 to elect Montfort temporary Count of Toulouse, the triumph was nearly ruined by an awkward experience. After feuding with Pedro of Aragon, their nominal overlord, for a decade, the citizens had declared Montpellier an independent city, so they refused Montfort entry. Despite the minor embarrassment, the Council of Montpellier did make him heir to the Count of Toulouse's lands. However, there were two problems. One, there was no official reason to dispossess Raymond, and two, those lands were under the overlordship of the kings of England, France, and Spain, and the Emperor of Germany. In particular, Pietro of Benevento felt that as papal legate, he lacked the authority to dispossess Raymond. Final approval depended on the Pope, so the matter was added to the itinerary of the Fourth Lateran Council. Montfort did not share the legate's belief in legalities and acted as if he was Count of Toulouse. The Fourth Lateran Council took place in November 1215, bringing together 61 archbishops, 412 bishops, 800 abbots and priors, as well as hundreds of representatives from every kingdom, duchy, and county, as a demonstration of the papacy's dominance over Christian churches and Innocent's role as supreme head of that church. The Fourth Lateran Council was the first council where both church leaders and lay leaders were invited. However, the invitation was not a move towards power sharing. In fact, it was the opposite. The attendees presented their respective opinions, which were consulted by the Pope, who then made a unilateral decision. The conclave lasted a month but accomplished many far-reaching changes. Trial by ordeal was replaced by Roman law. The barons of England were excommunicated for compelling their sovereign to accept the Magna Carta. Any Jew in Europe had to wear a yellow circle badge on their clothing to prevent them from pretending to be first-class citizens equal to Christians. Rome was filled with feuding nobles who were lobbying the papacy for support for their respective side. In particular, both sides of the German Civil War had numerous representatives. However, a key debate concerned the status of the Languedoc. Amaury and Bishop Fulk were there to argue against the claims of Count Raymond of Toulouse and Count Raymond-Roger of Foix. While the Count of Foix's anger was justified, his case was not helped by his admission that he slaughtered any crusader that he could. "Those robbers, those traitors and oath-breakers adorned with the cross have destroyed me. Neither I nor mine have laid hold on one of them who has not lost his eyes, his feet, his fingers, and his hands. And I rejoice to think of those I have killed, and regret the escape of those who got away." Faced with the undying hatred caused by his crusade, the Pope was overwhelmed. Hoping that a compromise would bring him peace and quiet, Innocent recommended that Montfort retain the lands of proven heretics and the rest be returned to the counts and the young Raymond of Toulouse, who had impressed the Pope with his Christian demeanor. Innocent genuinely did not want to disinherit Raymond's son or the young Trencavel. While a laudable sentiment, that generosity would ensure that Montfort lost almost all of his lands, and he was strongly supported by the local lands who had joined him and the bishops who had gained office through him. Led by Bishop Fulk, all of the southern clergy opposed this decision, arguing that Montfort should not lose what he had fought so hard to gain. Innocent gave in and accepted that the crusade would continue, thus legitimizing Montfort's rule over the Languedoc, an amazing accomplishment after 6 years of unrelenting warfare. Therefore, the council confirmed the crusade with the statement, "Catholics who take the cross and gird themselves up for the expulsion of heretics shall enjoy the same indulgences and be strengthened by the same holy privilege as is granted to those who go to the aid of the Holy Land." Essentially, crusaders could do whatever they wanted in the Languedoc, transforming the region into an area where self-defense was a crime against the church. Choosing to support Montfort, Innocent had named Toulouse as the Crusaders' capital, but the city had rejected that decision, which led to a siege. Montfort found that Count Raymond's son was a much better warrior than his father, and his heavy-handed approach cost him allies, especially in the Rhone region, where the cities had gained varying degrees of independence. Some, like Marseille, had become virtual republics controlled by popular associations. Raymond had accepted his limited authority in the region and bought sufficient compliance from the town councils with privileges and immunities, thus enabling him to focus his energy on his aggressive barons. Unable to accept other forms of authority, Montfort had worked to impose his will on the towns through bishops he had appointed. After 2 years of Montfort's heavy hand, the towns embraced Raymond when he returned. More important, Avignon, Marseille, and Tarascon quickly supplied him with an army that was reinforced over the next 2 months by most of the barons of Provence. The young Raymond would attack in the Rhone Valley, while Raymond would recruit troops in Spain and attack Montfort's rear. The campaign started with the town of Beaucaire, which was easily captured, but the garrison was able to hold out for 4 months. Unable to drive away the Southerners, Montfort settled in to besiege the besiegers, except the besiegers had genuine local support and were well supplied, while the Crusaders relied on heavily guarded convoys for supplies. Worse, Montfort received no Crusader pilgrims that year because of the Magna Carta, or rather the failure of the Magna Carta as a peace treaty between John and his barons. When John refused to follow the Magna Carta, or Great Charter, the barons rebelled, inviting Prince Louis to claim the throne, so he had led a large French army to England hoping for loot and lands, greatly shrinking the pool of potential recruits. After the besiegers demolished the castle walls, Montfort did something he had never done before. He admitted defeat on August 24th. The fall of Beaucaire had little strategic impact, but it showed Montfort's weakness and encouraged more revolts. The victorious siege was a huge triumph for the Southerners. How Innocent would have reacted to the return to warfare is unknown, since he died on July 16, 1216. He was succeeded by Honorius III, who had been Innocent's chancellor and adopted most of his policies, but had less energy since he was older. Moreover, he was fixated on Palestine and viewed the crusade in the Languedoc as an unnecessary distraction. Convinced that his main problem was a lack of money and that Toulouse was the center of his opponents, Montfort arrived at the city on August 29th and threatened to sack it unless the citizens handed over a lot of silver. The citizens resisted, but Bishop Fulk persuaded hundreds of prominent citizens to meet with Montfort outside the city, personally guaranteeing their safety. Montfort then arrested them and demanded a massive ransom, as well as the destruction of the city walls. When the citizens proved reluctant to bankrupt themselves, Montfort set his men loose to loot the city. However, he kept a relatively tight rein on the troops, forbidding any massacres, as if he wanted to ensure that the citizens would survive so they could be squeezed again the next time he needed money. These actions had one positive effect. They ended the factions of black and white brotherhoods, since now everyone despised Montfort and Fulk, his pet bishop. He had gained control of the city, but loosened his grip in order to focus on a new target, Provence, which did not even have the fiction of being part of the crusade. As if he did not have sufficient enemies, Montfort used a tame archbishop to annul the marriage of Petronilla, Countess of Bigorre, a vassal of Aragon, to a cousin of the King of Aragon, so she could marry his son. This blatant occupation of Bigorre aided Raymond's recruiting efforts. Furthermore, the Count of Foix had refrained from aiding the Raymonds in the hope of regaining his lands, but Montfort wanted an excuse to expand, so he raided the Count's lands, hoping to provoke retaliation. Displaying remarkable self-control, Foix complained to the Pope, who condemned Montfort and declared Foix an Orthodox Christian. Proving that it was a personal war, not a crusade, Montfort rejected the Pope's decision and occupied the Count's castle in February 1217, which drove Foix to join the two Raymonds. While his harsh rule would probably not strengthen the loyalty of his new subjects, Montfort was concerned about immediate survival. This ruthless approach enabled him to last long enough until his fortune changed when Louis's invasion of England failed and his army returned to France, increasing the pool of knights and soldiers who sought loot and lands under the cover of a crusade. Fortunately, the new papal legate Bertrand was furious that the towns of Rhône had refused to recognize his authority, so he became a firm supporter of the crusade, giving Montfort permission to invade Provence, where the young Raymond had made Avignon his capital. While not ready to face the Crusaders in battle, they were confident that they were secure behind the river fleet of Avignon, until Montfort led his army across a bridge of boats and soon captured much of Provence. It seemed that Montfort had regained the initiative, except Raymond Sr. finally launched his own invasion in mid-September and managed to bring his small army of volunteers to Toulouse, where he received an ecstatic welcome by the citizens, who then happily massacred any collaborators or crusaders they could find. Montfort laid siege to the city, but he could not prevent supplies or more men entering, so the siege dragged on during the winter. Captured crusaders were tortured and sometimes chopped into pieces, which were shot into the crusader camp by Trebuchet. His mercenaries complained about the lack of payment, and his commanders complained that the harsh treatment of the citizens had caused the rebellion in the first place, while Montfort likely consoled themselves with thoughts of razing Toulouse to the ground. However, Montfort was still outside the city by the spring, so the southerners had failed. Bishop Fulk and Alice de Montfort arrived in May with reinforcements, but Toulouse continued to draw in more volunteers, so the stalemate continued, until even more reinforcements arrived for Toulouse, including the young Raymond with men from Provence. As I have mentioned repeatedly, Montfort embraced war, so he was always in the middle of the fighting. While defending the siege engines against a sortie from the city, Montfort finally received his just reward for all of the misery he had caused when a stone from a mangonel smashed his helmet and his head to pulp on June 25th, 1218. Too many people saw his death to conceal the information, so Papal Legate Bertrand officially recognized Montfort's son Amaury as heir to the Count's lands, although he would be the nominal leader following the advice of senior captains. The Crusaders finally abandoned the siege on July 25th. News of his death signaled a massive celebration in Toulouse. While Amaury was brave, he seemed to lack his father's charisma and fanatical self-righteousness. Clearly, few thought that he would succeed, since many of his father's followers left. The chronicler Anonymous made a brilliant comment about the deceased count. Montfort's epitaph declared that he is a saint and a martyr who shall breathe again, and shall in wondrous joy inherit and flourish. He shall wear a crown and be seated in the kingdom. And I have heard that this must be so, if by killing men and shedding blood, by damning souls and causing deaths, by trusting evil counsels, by setting fires, destroying men, dishonoring nobility, seizing lands and encouraging pride, by kindling evil and quenching good, by killing women and slaughtering children, a man in this world can win Jesus Christ? Then certainly Count Simon wears a crown and shines in heaven above. Montfort's death should have ended the crusade, but it didn't, and I will explain why next episode. Thanks for listening.